Hi again, Beach Church. It's that time again for another tidbit from Liz. This time around, even though it's every other Saturday, I think it's funny because today I'm covering Ezekiel chapters 7 through 9, and ironically, the last tidbit I was covering the very same moment in history, but from Jeremiah chapters 19 through 21. What are the odds? Like two prophets, two voices, but proclaiming the same truth at the same time. That tells me that God wanted his people and us, here at Beach Church to pay attention. So here we see Ezekiel as a witness. He stands to the end of an era, and God's patience has clearly run out, and judgment is inevitable. And yet, in the middle of the destruction, there's hope. There's lots of hope for those marked by sorrow and sin. 7 through 9 shows us the cost of the rebellion and the corruption of worship and the mercy of a God who sets his people apart. And the end has come is basically Ezekiel 7. Ezekiel cries out, the end has come. And he's telling everybody, this isn't a warning anymore at this point. It's happening. Just like before from the other tidbit. Society collapses and wealth becomes, worthless, like inflation today, and violence fills the land. Leaders stumble. Time is up. No more delays, no more excuses. So the reflection I had on this was when the heart turns away from God, judgment doesn't stay far off. It comes near. So ask yourself, when in my life have I mistaken God's patience for his permission? That's a big question. Then we look over here at Ezekiel 8, and it's the heart of betrayal, right? So then God gives Ezekiel a vision of the temple, and what he sees in that vision is simply heartbreaking. An idol of jealousy, leaders bowing in secret, women weeping for Tammuz, priests turning their backs on God and worshiping the sun. This is all under the house of Israel, by the way. The very place that was meant for God's presence was being filled with idolatry, and his glory began to leave. So the reflection I had there was when ritual replaces relationship, when worship becomes hollow, that's when God's presence departs. So we don't want our worship to become hollow or our rituals to replace our relationship. There's a good marriage between the two, and we don't want to lose sight of either. What idols might be creeping into the temple of your own heart? It was a question I had to think about. Does this form of ritual or worship become the idol? Have I gotten too comfortable in one or the other? So then over here in Ezekiel 9, right, the vision shifts. And there's 6 executioners, and they stand ready. But with them is a man in linen. And he marks the foreheads of those who sigh and groan over the abomination around them. And this is important because everyone without the mark falls under the judgment, but those marked with sorrow are spared. Because even if you have, committed this idolatry or this sin, if when the Lord shows it to you, like before, if you're still soft and you're not hardened clay, you feel his conviction, you feel the sorrow. And so in that, God's judgment is real, but everyone that, doesn't have that mark of remorse, they fall under judgment, but those marked with sorrow, they're spared, and the grief over their sin becomes their salvation. So the grief over your sin and the sin cycles, that's your salvation. So the reflection I had there is God's judgment is real, but so is his mercy. And not to think that you can sin and sin and sin and take it for granted, but to still feel your heart be pricked says that he's still working on you and you're still moldable. So the question I had there was, do I grieve over sin or have I grown numb to it? Ask yourself that. Do you grieve over sin or do you grow numb to it? So to connect the dots, right? Earlier, Ezekiel acted out of God's warnings. And he was lying on his side, and he was rationing bread, and he was shaving his head. Those are signs before, but they're now reality of what's taken place. And here's the sobering truth. Sin doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in secret. And until finally God pulls back his presence, do you realize, oh, the judgment was him leaving? So judgment doesn't linger forever. Sanctuaries must be sanctified. And grief over sin does matter to God. So my question there is, are you cultivating a heart that is tender towards sin or hardened by compromise? So what do we take away from this? Because between the two tidbits, I can't help but think, Ezekiel 7 tells us the end can come suddenly. And Ezekiel 8 shows us that sin often begins where holiness should reign. And then 9 reminds us that God preserves those who are marked by his Spirit. So even in your sin, if you're convicted, he will preserve you and give you mercy. So my closing thought for everyone is that God's judgment isn't random. It unmasks sin. But even in his wrath, even in his anger, he remembers mercy. So when sin runs its course and it ends in destruction, but mercy, God's mercy, will always mark the way out. Final reflections for everybody here is, where am I ignoring God's warnings? And what idols have I allowed into my heart? Do I truly grieve over sin, or have I made peace with it? Am I still bargaining and negotiating, playing God in the situation? Am I marked by compromise or by God's Spirit? So that's it. Thanks for leaning into God's Word with me, and let's keep our hearts soft and our lives marked by his mercy. Hope you like this week's tidbit.